From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. In today's podcast, we'll be taking a look at the year ahead and talking to scholars from across MEI about what to watch for in 2020. I should note that today's program will be longer than usual and will be broken up into a couple of different segments, each with a different scholar. We'll be starting today's program with an overview of the region in 2020 with MEI Senior Fellow Robert Ford. Robert was previously a career member of the U.S. Foreign Service, serving as the ambassador to Algeria, deputy ambassador to Iraq, and ambassador to Syria, among other positions. Robert, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you for joining us today.
It's nice to be with you today.
To start off with, Robert, can you give us a brief overview, a sort of 30,000-foot view of where things stand in the Middle East at the beginning of 2020?
It's probably a cliche, but the Middle East really is in a state of flux and turmoil. Part of it involves the United States, but part of it does not involve the United States. The part that involves the United States, most importantly, is the confrontation between the United States and Iran. And that confrontation is taking place in the Persian Gulf area, and also in Iraq, and to a lesser extent in Syria. Of course, we've seen the exchanges back and forth between American forces and Iranian forces on Iraqi soil. That has, for the moment, subsided, but it is entirely possible that it will rear up again as the weeks ahead proceed, especially because the Iranians have proxy forces. It's not clear that the government in Tehran controls every little thing that its proxy forces do. There's a real command control issue for some of Iran's proxies in places like Syria and Iraq. So that's one issue of trouble in the Middle East. The second really has nothing to do with the Americans, but it has everything to do with authoritarian governments in the region being unable to meet the expectations of their populations in terms of good governance and economic opportunity. And so Algeria is about to conclude a full year of weekly large protests, which are unabated. Lebanon and Iraq are also seeing constant demonstrations. Violence, not so much. And it seems that protesters in these places have learned a lesson from the Arab Spring of 2011, lesson being stay peaceful, don't provoke violence, and try to maintain pressure on the street, but not in a way that provokes a crackdown. And we see governments in Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq trying to figure out how to contain these protests using force, but not all-out force, the way, for example, the Syrian government did starting in 2011 and then creating an entire civil war. So those two trends are ongoing, the U.S.-Iran confrontation, and then separate from that, this bubbling street protest.
So on the first point that you raised there, U.S.-Iran tensions, the news about the Middle East this year so far has really been dominated by that sharp escalation in U.S.-Iran tensions following the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. I'm curious to kind of delve into that a little bit more with you. How do you see that dynamic evolving going forward, and what impact has it had on the region more broadly?
Iran is really hurting right now economically. And it, too, is having a lot of street protests. In some ways, not so different from what we have seen in places like Lebanon and Iraq. Many Iranians expect much better things of their government in terms of accountability, in terms of good governance, and in terms of fighting corruption and providing greater economic opportunity. The American sanctions, the maximum pressure policy of the Trump administration clearly is aggravating Iran's economic problems. I think economic mismanagement has been endemic in the Islamic Republic of Iran for many, many years, but American sanctions under the Trump administration are hurting them even more. Given the large street protests and the economic difficulties, it is notable that the Iranian government takes a tough public line. But since Qasem Soleimani's killing, they have actually been much more careful not to provoke the Americans. They even appear to have forewarned the Americans through various channels of the missile strike on Ain al-Assad air base in Iraq. And there were no casualties. The Americans were able to take cover, as were the other coalition forces and even the Iraqi soldiers at the base. So there were no fatalities. It's not to say that the Iranians won't strike again. They very likely will, in my opinion. But they'll do it through proxies. How well they can control those proxies, we'll have to see. They absolutely have big influence on the proxies, provide them weapons, provide them money. I think the Iranians will wait a little while, and they'll try to build up circumstances where there's plausible deniability so as to avoid a massive American retaliation, which they fear would be destabilizing for the Islamic Republic inside Iran.
You touched on it just now, but I wanted to explore the kind of impact of the back and forth between Iran and the U.S. on Iraq specifically. Both the U.S. strike and the Iranian response took place on Iraqi soil, and it's really been kind of stuck in the middle between the two sides. How has it affected the political situation in Iraq?
Well, it's absolutely had an impact on Iraq, but I don't want to exaggerate it. The most important thing for listeners to know is that the Iraqis do not want to be in the middle of an American-Iran war. And that's true for all Iraqis, whether they be Iraqi Kurds in the northern part of Iraq or Iraqi Shia in the southern part of Iraq. They don't want to be caught in the middle. So when there is a risk of that kind of fighting breaking out, direct fighting on Iraqi soil, all Iraqis come together and say, we don't like this. But that is a separate thing from saying we want the Americans to withdraw. There is a big portion of the Iraqi political community, in particular, some of the Iraqi Shia Islamist elements, who are pushing for the Americans to be told to go home, to be ejected. There was a motion passed in the Iraq parliament, but Iraq's Kurdish and Sunni Arab parliamentarians, by and large, there were a few exceptions, but by and large, they did not vote for that resolution. And since then, in the past 9 days since that resolution, there has not been a huge push in Baghdad by those Iraqi Shia Islamists to follow up and compel the government to push the Americans out. Iraq is really in the middle of its own political crisis, separate from the Iran-American confrontation. That street protest movement I mentioned in Iraq is very big. It covers almost all of the southern and central parts of the country. And because of it, the government in 2019 had to resign. They have a caretaker government now. And there has been no agreement within the Baghdad political class or an agreement between the Baghdad political class and the street protesters about who should be in the new government and who the new prime minister should be. And so Iraq is sort of in stasis. It's in a holding situation while it tries to sort out its domestic political turmoil, even as it also tries to keep itself out of a U.S.-Iran confrontation.
One of the major developments, as you've referred to earlier, in the Middle East in 2019 was the emergence of large-scale protest movements in North Africa, in the Levant, Iran. Well, we don't have time to cover all of them in detail. I would like to explore one of them that you referred to earlier in a little bit more detail, which is Algeria. It's a country you know well and that you've been following closely. How do you see the situation there developing over the course of 2020?
Algeria is a really interesting country. And I think it's important for listeners to know that Algeria has deep ties to Europe. There are millions of Algerians who live in places like France, Belgium, Spain, and go back and forth. They visit family back in Algeria. And so there is an awareness among the Algerian population of how people in Europe live. And of course, they watch satellite TV, they watch French TV all the time. And so they have a set of expectations which are different from, say, the expectations of their grandparents. That is the generation that fought a very bitter war to get French colonialists out of Algeria. But the younger generation, while respecting the sacrifices required to get the French out of Algeria, they really now want a more modern government. They want far greater economic opportunity. And so they have been marching by the hundreds of thousands, in some cases maybe approaching 1 million on Fridays. And students have been doing their own separate rounds of protests every Tuesday. Those protest marches continue, and so there will be another march tomorrow, Friday. And the government, for the most part, has not repressed them heavily. They have picked off here and there particular protesters, particularly ones who have carried Berber flags. There's a large part of Algeria's population has Berber roots. Most of the country does, in fact. And the government's effort to sort of try to divide Arabs from Berbers failed. The Algerian street protest movement has remained very unified and publicly calls for national unity and publicly calls for the protests to remain peaceful. There was an election at the very end of 2019. Turnout was very low, but a man named Abdelmajid Tebboune was elected president. He is not a new figure. He is not a symbol of political change. He's very much from the old system. His cabinet had some younger technocrats, but was the most important cabinet positions, foreign affairs, finance, interior, were again held by people who came from the discredited old system. Street protest movement has not welcomed them and continues to demand that there be a complete rupture with the old system. And so the confrontation continues in Algeria week by week. The government's legitimacy is questionable. Some parts of the Algerian population absolutely don't want chaos. They don't want a new civil war. And so they're not on the streets marching, but a lot of people are. And so far, after a year of this, the country has avoided violence, which is a very good thing. But there really needs to be, at some point, a kind of dialogue between the protest movement and the government. But the protest movement itself has no leadership. And because it's so amorphous in terms of who it is, it's just literally neighborhood by neighborhood. It's hard for the government to negotiate with something like that. I have some sympathy with where the government is, but they're going to have to give space for the protest movement to actually develop a leadership and then begin a dialogue with it.
We're running a bit short on time, but aside from the issues we've touched on already of U.S., Iran, Iraq, and Algeria, what do you see as the other most pressing issues in the Middle East this year, and what will you be watching kind of most closely over the coming months?
The war in Syria is still a huge tragedy. Even as we speak, parts of northwestern Syria are under bombardment. The United Nations on January 15th issued a report that said that about 350,000 people have been displaced from their shelters, their homes in northwestern Syria. The Russians and the Syrian government are both committing war crimes regularly. And the human tragedy is enormous. And to the extent that there are new surges of refugees, there are going to be political repercussions in places like Turkey and potentially even in parts of Europe like Greece. So listeners should pay attention. The Syrian civil war is winding down slowly, gradually, painfully, but it's not finished. The Americans are still deployed around a few small oil fields in far eastern Syria, and we wait to see if Sunni extremists, whether in western Iraq or eastern Syria, begin to pose a serious new threat again. They are not there yet. They're very small-scale groups, not capable of controlling territory, hit-and-run attacks, no more. But that is also something to watch.
Robert, we'll have to leave things there, but thank you very much for joining the program today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Next up, we'll be talking about Yemen with Fatima Abo Alasrar. Fatima is a non-resident scholar here at MEI, and her work focuses on Yemen, Iran, and the Gulf. Fatima, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair.
To start with, can you give us a brief overview of where things stand in Yemen as we begin 2020?
Let's say parties to the conflict are trying to explore possibilities for peace in the north part of the country. And this was following the Riyadh agreement that occurred between the Saudi government or facilitated by the Saudi government between the internationally recognized government of Yemen and the Southern Transitional Council, which asked for secession. And I think seeing that there was progress on the southern front, that perhaps it's time to replicate this progress to the northern front and find a deal with the Houthis, especially with the lack of progress that we see as the Arab coalition hasn't been able to give any significant gains or change the situation to its advantage for the past, specifically for the past couple of years.
So kind of a stalemate on that sense and a reassessment of the situation, kind of a taking stock.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And especially it's an assessment after the attacks that have occurred in Aramco. It seems that the Houthis were able to reach their objective by pressuring Saudi Arabia to reconsider and to actually accept some of the Houthis' demands. And, I think Houthis want to be recognized as an important power. They want to basically have the ultimate say in the governance of Yemen, but at the moment is if they are recognized by the regional allies in any deal, that would be a significant win for them. And from that perspective, I think that the Saudis have been really keen on trying to, basically stop the Houthis from achieving all of their objectives and stop Iran in using the Houthis in a way where it gets to Saudi Arabia and the rest of the region. Majority of Yemenis see this as perhaps just an exclusive deal between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis and not necessarily a deal that would touch on how Yemen would be governed. There are, of course, complexities in this war. It's been 5 years of accumulative grievances from all parties to the conflict, different political parties, different regions. And, the conflict in Yemen just has so many different faces. But this face, which we often see in the media, which is between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia, might come to see a deal. Of course, all of this hangs in the balance after General Qasem Soleimani's assassination in Iraq. Houthis consider themselves as part of the axis of resistance. They're proud of it. And of course, just like Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah in Lebanon, Abdul Malik al-Houthi had vowed to avenge Qasem Soleimani. And it could be quite destructive to the peace process if Iran calls on the Houthis to avenge his death.
Also, I'm curious, in recent days, we've learned that the U.S. targeted another leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Abdul Reza Shalai, in Yemen, and that strike wasn't successful. But how is that likely to affect the IRGC's operations in Yemen?
I think the IRGC's operation are just going to continue unabated. that's part of Iran's power. It has been, I think no one knew about Jalai for the past 5 years. And in fact, many have attempted to say that Iran is not operational in Yemen. So from that perspective, I think that the IRGC are just going to continue. There are, of course, rumors, not necessarily rumors, from Iranians' websites and opposition websites, reports that Mustafa Mohammad Mirzai, who is also a member in the Islamic Republic Guards, was the person who is targeted in the operation. The website has said that he has been killed in an attack in one of the axis of resistance countries, but there's reason to believe that he was killed in Yemen because he was operational in Yemen. The pursuit of this operative, of course, is significant because he has been in Yemen for a very long time and cultivated strong allies and relationships with the Houthi officials. But I think that if they are successful in taking him down, that basically someone else will step up to the game, just as we saw with Qasem Soleimani's death.
There are other people in the IRGC that will step up and take on these kind of operational roles. What does that do to the kind of broader Iran-Houthi relationship, though?
So ultimately, I think that there's two ways where I could see this going. If Iran calls on the Houthis to become a bit more active in the axis of resistance at this time, that would be really premature because their power hasn't come to full fruition. I think that it will come to full fruition after they have a deal, after they sit in a power sharing deal with the government of Yemen. That's when they will be able to act with perhaps some type of a protection. So I think it would be quite suicidal for them to, for example, act in a big way against U.S. interests or against Saudi Arabia at this current time, because that will affect the rhetoric of peace. In September last year, Mahdi al-Mashat, the president of the Houthi militia, said that they would like to explore the possibilities of de-escalation with Saudi Arabia, that they will stop the attacks against Saudi Arabia if the kingdom responds in kind. And of course, at this point in time, if they decide to do otherwise, they will be basically shooting themselves in the foot. At the same time, I think that the Houthis really feel that through this peace agreement, through any peace of agreement, through a recognition that they are there, through a power sharing mechanism that could return things back to normal for them, that they could have more control, more freedom, more ability to become integrated politically in the society instead of being the political pariah that they are at the moment. So they definitely see significant gains from the peace process that would make it quite foolish for them to retaliate or to just abide by Iran's orders at this specific time.
We're running a bit short on time, but where do you see things going in 2020, and what are your thoughts on the prospects for peace this year?
I think 2020 is going to be just as unpredictable as the former years. You could see some good statements and perhaps good action, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's always good intention. I know the Riyadh agreement is going well, but all the messages that are coming out from the southern leadership still maintain a desire for secession. And I think that this cannot be remedied overnight. And I think it's perhaps beyond the Riyadh agreement to remedy. in terms of the peace process. There needs to be a parallel track where we think about governance, where we think about how can we not just think about societal reconciliation after the 5 years of war, but how do we bring back trust in institutions? How do we strengthen local governance? How do we bring back community participation? How much do we also just build confidence between people and their representatives after all of these 5 years of hostilities? I'm slightly skeptical that this new year is going to bring some type of a radical change or even a genuine change. But I'm sure that it will bring some type of change. We just don't know how it's going to look like.
Well, inshallah, hopefully it'll be something good.
Inshallah.
We'll have to leave things there, but thank you so much for joining the program today, Fatima. And thank you for joining us. Next up on the podcast, we'll be speaking with Emad Badi about the conflict in Libya. Emad is a non-resident scholar at MEI and a policy leader fellow at the European University Institute, focusing on Libya. Emad, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
To start off with, can you give us a brief overview of where things stand in Libya as the year begins?
Well, I guess the watershed moment for Libya in the past was the past year on the 4th of April of 2019 when Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar launched his offensive on Tripoli a few days actually before a national conference was supposed to bring the warring parties together and cement a power sharing agreement whereby responsibilities of each party would be determined. The offensive was portrayed as a quick, let's say, blitzkrieg, where Haftar would capture Tripoli and impose a fait accompli. But unfortunately for him, let's say, this has turned into now, and we're entering the 10th month of war, with several Western armed groups aligning under the government of national accord and defending the capital, Tripoli, against his Libyan Arab armed forces, Haftar's coalition. The conflict has so far somewhat stalled. There's a stalemate. It unfortunately has caused a humanitarian crisis where hundreds of thousands are displaced and almost 2,000 civilians are dead as a result. And that's where roughly things stand right now. On the diplomatic side of things, we've seen international maneuvering, let's say, with the announcement of the Berlin conference that was supposed to be held in Germany now this Sunday on the 19th. And unfortunately, the void that was left by Europeans and Americans in terms of dealing with this crisis over 10 months has brought in, let's say, not new players, but has accentuated the interventionism of players that had a lighter footprint in Libya, like Turkey and Russia, for example, that are on opposite side of this conflict.
On that latter point, that is one of the more kind of high-profile and notable developments in recent months is the growing involvement of Russia and most recently of Turkey. What's driving that involvement, and how has it affected the dynamics on the ground?
Well, in terms of the Turkish involvement, I would say it's motivated by different facets, one of which is economic, obviously. I think that's at the forefront of the Turkish agenda. Turkey has a lot of outstanding contracts in Libya from the Gaddafi era. It views in Libya, let's say, a potential ally in a region where it is increasingly isolated. The other facet that is linked to the economy is trade and maritime, I would say, because we've obviously seen that in the past year, Turkey has signed an agreement, two memorandums of understandings, one of which was military to prop up or to support the government of national accord. The other was the signing of an MOU that would establish an exclusive economic zone between Turkey and the government of national accord. And that has caused a lot of problems, especially in scenes outside Libya, with a wider coalition aligning against Turkey because of what it viewed as its increasingly nefarious, let's say, approach in the Eastern Med. So you had a coalition of Greece, Cyprus, Italy, Egypt, Israel, France that aligned against this Turkish agreement. So that's on the Turkish side of things. On the Russian side of things, Russia has also a lot of Gaddafi-era contracts in Libya. I wouldn't say that, as opposed to probably most of the other Haftar backers, Russia is probably operates more on realpolitik basis than other Haftar backers that are more beholden to him ideologically. Russia doesn't really have this angle of anti-Islamism, but it saw in the void that the US and Europeans left an opportunity to insert itself in the Libyan conflict militarily and then leverage that as a power broker. But however, this, let's say, gambit somewhat backfired because in the recent days, a few days ago, Haftar refused to sign the ceasefire agreement in a meeting that was jointly brokered by the Turks and the Russians in Moscow.
Yes, I was going to say, both Sarraj and Haftar were in Moscow this week following Russian President Vladimir Putin's recent visit to Istanbul, where he worked out this sort of joint ceasefire deal with Recep Tayyip Erdogan on both Syria and Libya. And that seems not to have panned out especially well on either front. But in the case of Libya, as you mentioned, Haftar left the Russian capital without even signing the deal. What impact do you think that's likely to have? And can Haftar really afford to give Putin the cold shoulder here?
I think that what we need to take into account is basically almost two dynamics. The dynamic whereby Haftar actually went to Moscow and his forces somewhat respected the ceasefire, along with the Government of National Accords coalition of militias in western Libya. Both sides have respected the ceasefire, but the fact that Haftar went to Moscow is more a symptom of the collective effort or a collective agreement between his foreign backers, including Russia, the Egyptians, and the Emiratis, to actually get him there and see what terms the deal will have. Now, the deal that was proposed was one that gave significant leverage and a significant role also to Turkey. And I think that's part of the reason why Haftar's backers did not really approve of it and influenced him into actually refusing to sign. The other facet is also that Haftar knows fully well that he is afforded support by the Emiratis, for example, regardless of whether he would sign the agreement or not. So in terms of whether the question shouldn't be whether he didn't sign the agreement because he has other allies or if it's because of failure of Russian diplomacy, the question should really be whether there could be a ceasefire agreement or a peaceful resolution to the Libyan conflict that involves Haftar in the first place, because he really views things in zero-sum terms. There's a well-established pattern of him always going for the military solution and always reneging on any political solution. I think that's the key takeaway from this from this development. And overall, what this bodes for Libya in terms of prospect-wise is obviously there's going to be more conflict, because by reneging on this ceasefire agreement, by refusing to sign it, the natural next development, the next phase, is ultimately going to be decided militarily, regardless of whatever happens in Berlin.
Well, I was about to pivot to that, and I have a sense I know what your answer will be, but what are your expectations about the Berlin conference going into that this weekend?
Well, as I said, the thing is now the solution is going to be military. But on Berlin itself, I think that somewhat the Europeans kind of shot themselves in the foot, because this was an initiative that would have been constructive as it was initially envisioned. It was envisioned as a forum, a process that would culminate in a conference whereby everyone or all states involved would commit to, first of all, tapering or stopping foreign interference in Libya, and then respecting the arms embargo. Not only has it significantly now changed scope from that, it also is now including Libyan parties, so like Haftar and Sarraj, which are now invited to Berlin. And in terms of optics, what it looks like is that Haftar, after reneging on or refusing to sign the ceasefire agreement, is now rewarded with red carpet treatment in Berlin. So even in terms of optics perspective, it looks bad. And on a broader note, I think the Germans somewhat traded a constructive and a delay in the process of this conference, because they got a bit exasperated with the amount of foreign interference and the amount of politics surrounding Libya, because they're new players in diplomacy. And they traded that for expediency. So having this conference without necessarily knowing what its impact would be. And ultimately what that means is that it might be redundant within the broader scope of a peaceful resolution of the Libyan conflict, at least.
We're running short on time, but looking past Berlin, where do you see things going, and what will you be watching most closely over the coming months?
I think now one of the main actors, let's say, that gave Haftar an edge militarily was Russia. Russia, which inserted itself in September, let's say, or late August, September, into the Libyan conflict with mercenaries. So the main question, and what I will be looking at, is Russia's role in Libya and what Russia will be doing, especially since Putin was personally embarrassed by Haftar not signing on an agreement that he personally invested time in, let's say, brokering, because he did make phone calls, etc. But I think that's going to be the main factor that will influence the shape of the conflict in Libya now.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, but Emad, thank you very much for joining the podcast, and we hope to have you back on soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.